So throughout this training series, we've gone through the how of DAISI 2.0, how to use it as a tool to store and maintain data from your programs. And to wrap up our training series, the focus of our training today is the why. Why do we go through all of the trouble to collect all these data in the first place? So the first part of this training will address the post-exit indicators specifically. And then during the second part of our training, we'll zoom out to talk more broadly about data collection and maintenance. So first, we'll talk about post-exit indicators. So what are post-exit indicators? So they are essentially just measures of student success after they exit from adult education programs. They're sent to the National Reporting System, which is a federal agency, to help the government determine the success of adult education in our state. And they're broken down by demographic groups such as age, gender, and ethnicity, and also by barriers to employment. They're not collected directly by adult education agencies, but the data that you collect while students are enrolled allow us to calculate these using data matching. So why are post-exit indicators important? First of all, they help us determine who we're serving. They show us the total number of participants from each demographic subgroup that I just mentioned each fiscal year. By reviewing these data, we can see which populations are being served most frequently and which populations might be falling through the cracks. Another reason is that they reflect the impact of our work. As you all know, an important goal of adult education is to help participants enter into sustainable and fulfilling employment. That's no news to you. Post-exit indicators help us review and assess the impact of our work by showing us the employment rate and median income of participants after they exit from our programs. And finally, they help the NRS accurately assess our state's performance and set reasonable performance targets. So this is really important. So the NRS uses a tool called the Statistical Adjustment Model to assess our state's performance in the context of economic conditions and participant characteristics, such as the barriers to employment that you all are familiar with. So for example, if Illinois experiences an economic downturn, using the statistical adjustment model, it won't be judged in the same way as another state experiencing a fall in unemployment and a surge in wages. So in layman's terms, the statistical adjustment model kind of just levels the playing field. So you might be wondering why we're talking about post-exit indicators if, as I just mentioned, you don't collect them directly, but you do play a really important role in helping us calculate them. And in order to help us ensure that our post-exit indicators are accurate, one thing that you can do is to collect and verify as many Social Security numbers as possible. All of our employment information that I just mentioned is calculated using data matching. And without complete and accurate Social Security numbers, this is nearly impossible. So we don't discourage providers from serving students without Social Security numbers, but it's important for us to work to collect and verify the Social Security number of every single student who does have one. Another way that you can help us ensure our post-exit indicators are accurate is to collect and verify barriers to employment. As I mentioned in the previous slide, the statistical adjustment model cannot be accurate unless our barriers to employment are complete and also up to date. Next, we're going to kind of zoom out and talk about data collection and maintenance. So we often talk about how important it is to have good data, but what does that actually mean? So one example of a characteristic of good data is that they're complete. One of the most important things you can do to make sure that your data are complete is to make sure that you're collecting each measure for every single student. So for example, if you only collect the barriers to employment of some student, but not all students, this actually renders all of your barriers to employment data useless. Because if a record indicates that a student has no barriers to employment, there's no way of knowing that it's because they really don't have any barriers to employment, or if it's because that just wasn't collected. And if you don't know how many students in your program have barriers to employment that are missing in comparison to those that just don't have any barriers to employment, how can you possibly calculate the percentage of students that face each barrier? So it's really important that we're collecting data for every single student in our program. Another thing you can do, another characteristic of good data is that they're reliable. And this means that the results can be replicated in the same conditions. So one thing you can do, so one example of this is asking students for Social Security numbers both during enrollment and also during pre-testing. This can help you identify and correct any discrepancies that you have in your records. Finally, good data are valid, and this means that the measures are measuring exactly what they're supposed to be measuring. And in order to make sure that your data are valid, it's really important to refer to the definitions of measures in the Adult Education Provider Manual. So for example, when you're collecting those barriers to employment, do you know what low income means? Do you know what a displaced homemaker is? Making sure that you're collecting the correct data on all of those is really going to help your data be accurate. And I'm sure that none of this is news to you, so I won't dwell on this too much, but it's really important to have good data at your disposal. And one reason for this is because they help us inform how we identify and solve problems, both at the programmatic level and at the state level. So one example of this was the decision to waive generation earlier this year. In order to make that decision, the ICCB analyzed generation data from providers across the state. And without accurate and up-to-date information, there would have been no way that we would have been able to make that decision. Another reason that data are important is because they allow us to do equitable work. We know that equity is one of the focuses of our state right now. They help us compare the performance and enrollment of the various population groups that we serve. As we previously mentioned, that can help us see who we're serving most frequently and which population groups we might not be targeting as vigorously. And finally, good data help us set and reach reasonable goals. So this can be, some examples of this are the NRS Core Performance Report, the NRS Core Performance Measures Report, which helps us keep an eye on post-testing, and the Enrollment Report, which helps us keep an eye on generation. These not only help us see how we're on track to meet our goals, but also it helps us see what we need to do in order to achieve them. And finally, they impact the performance funding, as you all probably know. So the ICCB uses programmatic data to award performance funding to adult education providers throughout the state. That's why it's really important to keep good records so that the hard work that you do with your students is accurately reflected. These are just a couple of examples of best practices for data collection and maintenance. We've already talked about data validation. These are kind of two examples of data validation here. But another thing that you can do to ensure that your data are valid and up to date is to keep up with data entry throughout the year. Don't just wait until your quarterly reports are almost due and try to put in like 3 months worth of attendance records in like 2 days, because the more time you spend doing those attendance records at the same time, the more that opens up to room for errors. And then another thing you can do is to maintain contact with participants throughout the year, so that if you have missing data in any of your records, you can reach out to them, and it'll be a little less of a surprise, and because they'll be used to hearing from you. And also, if you can identify that your contact information is incorrect or incomplete before you need that missing information, it'll be really helpful down the line. So in the spirit of the new year, I thought it would be nice to kind of wrap up our training series by setting goals. So in the chat, I'd like everyone to type one goal that you have to improve the quality of your program's data. And it can be something that we mentioned during this training, or it can be something different. But I'm interested to hear the way that you're looking forward to improving your data between now and the end of the fiscal year. So I'm going to end this training the same way that I do all other trainings by presenting you with a few different options for additional support. As you all know, there's an online help guide at www.iccb.org/DAISY/. If you have any technical questions or system malfunctions, you can contact the DAISY support desk. And any general and policy-related questions can either be directed to me or your regional support staff person.